So hi and welcome to our habit forming talk today. Charles and I are excited to have you guys. And like Charles was just mentioning, we do have about 40 minutes planned for the talk today, and we'll also be doing about a 10-minute question and answer afterwards. So please feel free to pop your stuff in the chat, and we can take care of that at the end of the practice or at the end of the session, or we might be able to address it while we're talking as well. So I'm really excited about that. But this is one of, I think I always say this, but this is another favorite topic of mine. And Charles and I have a lot of knowledge around how we integrate habits into our talks, into our teachings, into our consults, and stuff like that. And if you don't know me, I'm Christina McGrath with SwellFit Living, and I work with busy people and entrepreneurs, and I help them optimize their health and wellness with consultations, personalized anti-inflammatory nutrition plans, combination of movement and stress relief tactics. And I really work with people's one-on-one with people's lifestyles. And I am going to be coming out with a 7-week awesome creativity and also kind of mind and body course. And I'm excited about that. So Charles.
And, for those of you who may...
Oh, hold on. I think I just muted you.
I've been a designer for most of my life and most of my working life, but I also do public speaking, and I would be speaking right at this moment if it wasn't for COVID, but there we are. There's other things to do, and there's a lot to get on with. And I think you're going to sort of launch off, Christina, with our talk about habits tonight.
Yes. So a couple of the things that we wanted just to start off with. So we'll be referencing about 3 people that we've been following and that we definitely like to use a lot of their information, but forming habits. So how you do anything is how you do everything, which is so interesting. So forming good habits will lead you to better results. And that's by Bob Proctor. And he does a lot of mindfulness meditation, but he is definitely one of the in the forefronts and the leaders in what you think and how you behave is definitely how what resonates in the rest of your life.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just having a look at what habits are and how they work. I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Yep, I can. So hopefully, let me just do that. Hopefully you can see that. So this is basically the pattern, the formula for any habit. Every habit starts with some sort of cue. It seeks a reward, which is the craving, and it follows through with some sort of routine, some sort of habit, some sort of ritual, something that you go through. Now, the really, really simple example of this would be something like the fact that you get out of the bath, that's your cue, you pick up your towel, that's your routine, and you probably dry yourself in exactly the same way every single time. Most of us do. You go through the same routine. The reward is, of course, that you're dry, you feel clean, you feel comfortable, you smile. And I'll show you a few examples of how this has been used in advertising and everything else a bit later. The interesting thing about habits, of course, is that they get relegated very quickly to your unconscious thinking. So they may be formed in your conscious thinking or by circumstance or by all sorts of reasons. But what tends to happen with habits is that they're shelved or they're filed away because they save energy. Now, I think we've mentioned last week, and I'll mention again this week, the brain, the body, everything always wants to get back to a state of homeostasis. Basically, it wants to make things as uninvolved as possible and habitual. And that's why it relegates habits to unconscious thinking. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that they then become our assumptions, they become our beliefs, and that makes life or at least habits, very, very difficult to change. Because they're highly embedded into our emotional responses to things, our very, very sort of primitive responses to things, and our very sophisticated responses to things, because we learn a lot about habits. I'm just going to get rid of that now. So we have energy-saving brains, and the way that they save energy so that they can make habits is that our brains chunk things together. So the reason that we chunk, and it's the same with any sort of taxonomy of any kind, any hierarchy, is that we chunk things together so that they're easier to grab and to get hold of and to remember. And this really relates very closely to memory, of course, because what we do is we group things so that we can find them again. Now, habits actually enable us to be able to do that. And the whole sequence of habit and habit change is being able to identify the habit, which is extremely difficult in most cases. Habits are something that we absolutely have to have, because in order to progress in any way, mentally or physically, we have to sort of learn a certain amount. Then we filter that, and that becomes a sort of cyclical, actually I should be going up, a cyclical process, because it's usually a good cycle. But as we all know, that sometimes you get incredibly repetitive thoughts that pester you and sometimes turn into very bad habits. Now I'm going to try and share one more or another slide, which is this one. Right, so there are basically 4 types of change that are related to habits and related to change in general. One is the psychological change, the other is the physiological change, spiritual change, and also evolutionary change. Now, evolutionary change obviously is pretty slow. Now, most of these, but not all, are related to what we call the dopamine cycle. And that is partly the reward end of everything. We do things because we want an outcome. And the best example of that, I think, is really the slot machines, which in casinos, particularly the big casinos in Vegas, which are amazing, I have to say. But in the slot machines, there was a time where, particularly when the electronic machines first came out, where the programmers for the slot machines were asked to program the machines, most of the machines, so that they would nearly produce a winning result. Now, it is still random, I believe, so we're told. But the reason for that is that then you have the expectation of a result, and that result then encourages you to want to, or that reward, I should say, encourages you to want to have the same routine that will then produce that kind of reward. Now, obviously, the big reward is the win, but the nearly win is nearly as good as a proper win. So I think you're going to talk about sort of the tiny changes that actually can make the difference now, Christina.
Yeah, so Tiny Habits by John Fitzgerald. He starts to talk about, so what Charles is talking about is like, we like to be rewarded. So we're going to keep a habit if we're rewarded by the result. So he starts to break down how we can break down habits and then also create that reward at the end. So he starts out really the creation of habits. As you think about what you want to tag on, there's a couple things that I'll go over, but basically when a behavior is really simple, we don't have to be motivated to do it. And I think that's the big thing, is that if you can make something super simple that his kind of things are, takes less than 30 seconds, takes no real effort, really doesn't take motivation, and it doesn't create obviously any pain or bad emotions. The other thing, besides it being super simple and taking no motivation, very important, it shouldn't be something that you should do. It shouldn't be something that one of your friends says, oh, I do this all the time, so it's great for me. That might not be for you. It really has to be something like that you're like, gosh, I'd really like to, if you really like push-ups and you would like to add more of those into your life. Like, I don't like them at all. So I would not choose that as one of the things. It's more of a should thing. So pick something that you want to create in your life and you want to do that is going to be a good step in a healthier direction, whether it's towards creativity or towards health or towards wellness or anything like that. So
the other interesting thing, sorry. The other really interesting thing is there was a very long study, again done at Stanford University, that checked whether willpower was actually a good way to change habit. What they found, which surprised them as well, the people doing the research, was that actually willpower is an exhaustible resource.
Yeah.
So you can use up your willpower, and you do become sort of stressed and exhausted at the end of it. So willpower isn't actually a very good way to change habits, and we'll come to how you change habits a bit later, because it takes so much effort. And again, we're back to the same thing, that the brain and the body would much rather use as little energy and effort as possible, or at least keep things in balance. Sorry, Christine.
No, keep going. I'm very interested in this because I remember, just talking with businesses when I was working in London, and I know you talk with businesses a lot too. I always talked about, your ability to use motivation and willpower, and kind of that does decrease during the day as you make decisions.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, but the habits we're talking about here, if you can create habits that don't take much choice, but can increase your health or your whatever it is, then you can save your choices or your willpower or your motivation to other things. So that's why the creation of habits are so important to us, to actually get ahead and make good choices throughout the day without kind of wasting our mind and our willpower on other smaller choices.
I think what we're getting to is that what you need for habit change, for permanent or more permanent habit change, is that you need to, we'll come to the 4 sort of key rules about habit change later on in this. But the key thing really is to make it easy and doable. Now, there's techniques that you can use to actually make things easy and doable. But if I go, stepping out of the shower is an example of one thing. But for instance, if it's a cold morning and I've just woken up and I'm thinking, right, I really ought to go for a run. If I don't put on my running gear, I won't go for a run. Mm-hmm. But if I put it on, then too late. Okay, I've done it now. I have to go for a run. So you can use that ease with just small triggers, and I think that's where they're getting onto. The other example given in the book Atomic Habits, which is the James Clear book, which is one of the books that we've been sort of looking at, is this thing of navigation. Is that if you make a very small difference, if you're leaving from, say, Liverpool to go to New York, if you make a small difference of, let's say, 1 degree, either north or south, and you're out, you will end up somewhere completely different. Unfortunately, I can't work out exactly where you will end up, but you'll end up miles away because of the distance. And this is something I'll show you a little bit later. There is a little graph that will explain that the symbol of this, or the metaphor for this, is an ice cube. Is that if you're in a room where there is sub-0 degrees and it begins to warm up, then nothing happens until you reach 0, and then suddenly there's a tipping point. So the same with sort of steering yourself into a degree, is that as the degrees of the temperature rise, then suddenly there's a tipping point, and suddenly you find that the small things, the small steps that you've taken, and that being degree by degree, will actually make a huge difference in the past. The other thing is that if you take it negatively, then that's diminishing returns. So you're not actually sinking that far down, but you're not making any progress. And when you see the graph, you'll see that it becomes exponential in that sense. But sorry, again,
no,
we're
both we're good. We're totally good. I think that's a really interesting point to think about those 2 habits, and we can refer to both of our other talks about feedback. But I just wanted to address the couple things that you just said about the way to create habits, and 2 of the ways that Fitzgerald was talking about in the tiny habits is the starter steps. And the starter step, like you said, was putting on shoes. It's opening a book. It's like, getting out my yoga mat, like doing one or, that's it. And that will lead to the habit that you want to achieve. The other one is a tiny version of it, whether it's like you floss one tooth, you do 1 minute of meditation, you do one squat. It's a tiny version of what you'd like to actually work into. So whether it be the starter steps or the tiny versions, those are two ways to start to integrate small habits without taking from your kind of motivation bank, if you will.
I think it's important to mention as well that the thing is that habits are not bad things. That's how the brain, that's what they do. They actually make things into habits because it saves energy. And it's not just energy. It just facilitates so many things. What I quite like to do now is I'm going to give you my screen again for a moment. I want to talk about something that that's called the Pepsodent principle, which was developed by a guy called Claude Hopkins, he was in advertising. And let me just get the slide if I can. The Pepsodent principle, here it is, done. So, right, so the Pepsodent principle, what Claude Hopkins realized very early on is that if you create a desire, if you create the trigger, then you can create the reward as well, and that will change the routine. And this was done to incredible success with Pepsodent, which went worldwide and was a billion seller, or I don't know exactly the numbers. But the point was that the first thing he realized was, well, then let's invent something that does exist, but nevertheless is undesirable, and that would be the cue. So the cue is always very, very closely related to the reward because of the craving that creates the desire for the reward. So he said, right, there's film on your teeth, and of course you have to clean the teeth because you want a beautiful smile. Now it sounds incredibly, incredibly simple, but what he did was identify, and clearly identified, the cue and the reward, and that's the illustration of the disgusting teeth on, well, it's on my left, I hope it's on your left as well, and the beautiful teeth on the right. But the thing that had to change was not the cue, not the reward, was the identification of those, but it was the routine in between. And the routine became brushing the teeth, but particularly Pepsodent, because only Pepsodent would end up by giving you that beautiful smile that you wanted. And these are the adverts that were, it's around about the 1950s, just after the war. And so basically they changed behavior. Now, habits are so tightly knitted with behavior, and it's because the brain always expects a reward or is looking for a reward all the time. Now, that can be positive or negative as well, and sometimes it can be avoidance, and it can sometimes be even the avoidance of uncertainty that spurs us into looking for the cue, which may be uncertainty, to look for a resolution of that into a reward or certainty as well. And there's a whole other section, just going to come back to the screen, there's a whole other section that we can talk about maybe another time, about uncertainty and how that relates to creativity and story building and belief. Because the other thing that that is worth mentioning, I think, is, and we'll come to again in a moment, is about Alcoholics Anonymous, of course. And what they realized with their 12 steps is that so very, very, very directly relates to changing behavioral habit, but they found that it works best when it's related to belief, and that belief was an incredibly important part of their 12-step process. Also was the whole sort of session of confession and everything else. I mean, it's quite complicated, but it's this signal that tells us when something is working, and that's what it's all related to. Now, advertisers are the geniuses, really the geniuses of understanding the psychology of cue and reward. And it's very simple. If you look at any advert, particularly toilet cleaner, I love toilet cleaner adverts, I have to say, because there's always some evil demon lurking just under the rim of the bowl that you've got to get rid of. And here is the solution. And the other example I think that we were talking about, Christina, is Febreze. Febreze very famously could not sell, but they were convinced it was a great product. But they could not make it sell as being the cleaning solution, as being all sorts of, and disinfectant, everything. What they found was that actually, and they did it by studying behavior that people were adopting in their homes when they were using Febreze, they realized that what was actually working was people wanted to feel proud of a clean, fresh smelling home. And that was the reward. So then they knew how to leverage their advertising. Febreze is also one of those sort of all-time great selling products that has changed how people behave. But yeah, you wanted to talk about anchors, I think, Christina.
Yeah, so now we're going to kind of come back to how, so talking about that whole cycle, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about achieving the habits, like on a personal level. So when you're thinking about your own habits, you're thinking about something that you need to, a cue, and then something that the reward, you're going to solve the habit in between. A way to think about how you want to structure your habits, and this is also another thing with tiny habits, is he decided that the easiest way to start to develop habits was to have the same frequency as another behavior. So for example, the flossing, and you're going to want to floss the same amount of times that you brush your teeth a day, I'm assuming, maybe. So you're thinking about that.
Only if you're American.
Only if you're American, maybe once a day. But so anyway, so thinking about linking those two habits together, the frequency as the same behavior that you want to achieve. So thinking about that when you're trying to pair up habits, or whether you're trying to habit stack, which is another idea.
And that's similar to James Clear's thing of piggybacking onto an existing habit. If you piggyback a new or desired new habit onto the back of the old habit, then you have a better chance of succeeding.
It's so much easier than saying that you're going to floss twice a day. If you instead, if you already have the frequency of one habit, that is so much easier, I feel like. And then also the other thing that he mentioned, which these seem so simple, but when you break it down, it's like, oh, that makes total sense. It's the same frequency, same location. So, flossing, but they're both in the bathroom. The other thing is that I find that if you have to go into another room, and this is another thing that James Clear said, it's like, it has to be super easy. So if you have to go in another room to design your habit around something else, it's probably not going to work. So you want to have it in the same location as another behavior you're stacking it onto. So, even I started, if you wash your face and then you put on moisturizer, I started to use a serum underneath. So that obviously stacked in between something else that was in the same location, and it was easy to integrate. So I'm thinking about those things. So frequency, location, and theme. So if you're thinking about kind of a healthy theme, obviously, taking care of a lot of like your facial things and your teeth cleaning and all that kind of stuff it's the same kind of theme. If you're doing a healthy theme, sometimes like what I've been doing too is I started to integrate 5 sun salutations in my morning routine, and now I added on, some squats to it. So I added on to something that I already developed. I added on another healthy habit onto that. So I think
there's one other, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go on. No, I was just going to say, there's one other element that sort of fits in with this, is the thing about time as well, is that, which actually none of them really speak about particularly. But what I found when I gave up smoking is that, and maybe Alcoholics Anonymous do, but I found that so long as I took it sort of 1 minute at a time first, I said, I've done 1 minute, I can do another minute. I've done 1 hour, I can do another hour. This is when I gave up smoking. And then I found that by using sort of the time, and I think it's almost like the Seinfeld method, which is if you get a calendar on a wall and you cross off the days that you've done a good habit or whatever it might be, then what you find is that you've got, or the game with yourself is to make an unbroken chain. So do not
Oh,
break.
yeah.
So, and it was the same when I gave up smoking all those years ago, that's 30 something years ago, is that I found that if I did it one step at a time, that the competition with myself, and almost a trick for myself, was to not break the chain. Oh, look, I've done 2 days. I'm sure I could do one more day, until it got to a month, until eventually it gets to a year, and then you forget all about it, and then you hate all smokers forever.
So this brings me up to, so that's interesting, because that, I feel like that unbroken chain is kind of a reward. So
Yeah,
it's
it
almost
is.
leading back
Absolutely.
to, like, with Fitzgerald, he always talks about celebrating your tiny habit. It's like, once you do it, you're like, yay, I did it. Or you mark it on the calendar, or you know, do something good for yourself, or whatever it is, but you celebrate that little victory, which totally helps, because whether I talk about it now or not, but it's emotion is directly related to how strongly your habits are going to take hold as well.
Oh, I think emotion is pretty much the key in everything, as
Yeah.
far as I'm concerned anyway. You can't decide without emotion. You can't do anything without it being informed. You use logic, obviously, and but you can't do anything unless emotion is somehow involved, because the famous example is from the philosopher whose name escapes me just this second, who gives an example of a robot that has got a bomb in front of him, and he's looking at the bomb and thinking, right, what are the possibilities to defuse this bomb, and what is relevant and what's not relevant? And without something that filters what's relevant, of course, the robot is completely blown up, because he's thinking about the tea in China, or the price of oil, or all those things that don't need consideration. So something kicks in always that says, right, this is a priority. And that is always an emotional response, I think. The other thing I wanted to talk about as well was rituals. And this is sort of very, very, very closely related to the behavioral habits, of course, but ritual becomes very, very important, because daily routines and rituals, again, reduce uncertainty, and they become part of everyday life. I don't mean ritual in a very sort of spiritual or esoteric sense. I mean just the little rituals that we do, which is basically having delegated things to habit, that give us these hooks or these pegs to put things on, and they become incredibly important in how we form ourselves and our relationship to the whole of the world outside of ourselves. What tends to happen in terms of trying to change habit, or particularly what Charles Duhigg goes into in his book, The Power of Habit, which is probably the most authoritative of all the books that I've read about habit, is that he says what you have to do is you have to use an old cue. You have to use that cue, and then you have to use the same reward. But the thing that you have to change is the routine that gets you the reward. So if you want to go for, if every afternoon you get up from your desk, if you're working in an office, and you go to the canteen and get something sweet to eat, that's all okay. But what you're looking for is what triggers it, which you have to work out. And that's the difficult part. What's the reward? Maybe that's the sugar rush or something like that. Or maybe it's just to, the reward he sort of cites is that perhaps it's just to get a change of scenery, in which case change the behavior. So go and see a friend, or go and talk to someone else. So he says replace the routine or replace the ritual. Rituals have got a whole other sort of aspect to them as well, but it's more about sort of interrupting the cycle if you want to change a habit, or if you want to replace a habit. And the one thing that surprised me to some extent is that all of them, that being James Clear, Charles Duhigg, and Fitzgerald, all say is that you can't actually eradicate a habit, but you can replace it with something else. And that really sort of doesn't quite sit right with me. I can't quite imagine. Some people, when they've been through great trauma of some kind, they do completely and utterly change rituals, habits, or behavior. So I don't quite get that. And that brings us back to then the relationship of habit to emotion. And again, I think that you cannot develop a habit, and you need habits, you do, without the intervention of emotion of some kind. And that sort of comes back to well, it's not my theory particularly, but the theory of how thoughts actually work and how sensations and perception works, in that everything that comes in is just raw information. That's all it is. You know, you do not have perception in your fingers, you do not have perception in your eyes, nor your nose, nor your ears, nor anything else. Perception happens in your brain. And the thinking is that it is then converted into something that let's call mentalese of some kind, a special language or filing system. And again, we have to use metaphors to speak about it because there's no other way to speak about it. So that then gets disseminated amongst other sensations that then somehow there must be an amazing, I mean, if only we could discover what the filing system was, we'd be doing brilliantly. That then picks up all those bits. And of course, the example is Proust with the À la recherche de temps perdu, where he smells the Madeleine, and that takes him all the way back to his great aunt. So how that works, I don't fully understand, except that I do understand that there isn't just one region in the brain for each and every function, that it is spread out over all sorts of different areas. And we spoke about that last time. But without any doubt, I think that this was your point when we were talking the other day, is that the stronger the emotion, the more deeply your brain wires that feeling or that sensation or that perception, perhaps is a better word to say. And belief is at the core of all of it. And you know, I'm gonna bring up one more slide if I can get it. And this is basically about action potential, really. Can I find it? Yeah, it's this one. Right. So this is actually, believe it or not, from Tony Robbins. But I think it's right. It's absolutely right. And the theory is that and it's the same with habit, is if you don't see the potential, you won't take the action. And if you don't take the action, you won't get a result. And if you don't get a result, you won't believe that there could be potential. And so the cycle goes on. Now that works spiraling upwards as a virtuous circle or as a vicious circle. It can go down just as well. So this sort of cycle, I think, always sort of brings home to me this complex relationship of building beliefs and habits, for that matter, that you have to have a habit to develop a habit, and therefore you develop the habit, which then creates a habit. So it goes round and round and round. But I think to some extent that is the learning process. That's how we learn. And to some extent, I suppose you could say, or maybe could you say, yeah, I'm going to say, you could say that learning was a question of submitting things to some sort of system, that being a habitual system or a system that you can tap into that is a habit in one way, shape, or form. It's a shame they don't teach more about sort of learning in schools, that's all. They teach you what to learn, not how to learn. But that's another story. So, Christina,
well,
emotion for the brain.
I was just going to talk about just one thing, since we have a second, just from teaching and consulting and training people in different sports and also with nutrition, is that we didn't tap on this, but the way to change a behavior or habit is also to catch yourself in the point that you want to change it. So if you're teaching a different sport, for example, and I saw you snowboarding and you did something that wasn't quite right, but I yelled at you and I was like, hey, change this, right now while you're doing it. instead of when you get down the hill and be like, hey, do you remember that time when you did this turn? And I want you to kind of do it different. If I actually get you in the act of doing that, your brain will wire to actually take on that information immediately, and you'll be able to change that habit quicker, which can also relate to a habit that you're trying to change. If you find the cue and then you find yourself doing the habit and being like, oh my gosh, I don't want to bite my nails or whatever it is, and then you realize you're doing the habit, catching yourself in the act of the habit can allow your brain to help you rewire that or changing that habit sooner.
So that is the basic principle of deliberate practice.
It is.
It's exactly that. It's the feedback. Well, that's one of the 4 sort of tenets, is that it's the feedback that you need in order to be self-critical or critical, in order to progress.
Yeah.
So that is, I mean, they are, in fact, it's quite interesting because particularly sort of sports training is very much related to tiny incremental changes to habits, to bad habits normally, in order to, I mean, if you think of a golfer's swing or a swimmer or whatever it is, it's just, you know, changing, particularly for a swimmer, it would be changing your hand position from that to that makes, you know, an extra, I don't know how much extra speed, but it gives you that extra tiny bit. And it's just the refinement, the constant sort of feedback and refinement that always sort of, that works with elite athletes, I think, particularly.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that, but if you want to start going over, the plan.
I do. So, right. So here, extracted from the books, working plans. Okay. So if this is the 4 rules and they come from James Clear, they're pretty much reiterated by Charles Duhigg, and I believe that they're also in Fitzgerald as well, is number 1, make it obvious. Make it very straightforward, make it obvious. Number 2 is make it attractive. Make sure that it's something you want, that is enticing. Otherwise you won't do it, you'll drop it very quickly. The 3rd rule is make it easy. And breaking down, if you want to change habit, breaking down the habit into tiny, small sections or behaviors, and making them all as easy as possible to change means that you have a better chance of changing the behavior that leads to the reward. And I suppose that the big thing is, if you get in your minds that this thing about cue, behavior, and reward, actually for you it probably goes that way, I don't know, depends if, well, maybe if you're in another country it goes the other way, it doesn't matter. If you get that in your head, then that is the approach to all habit change without any doubt, is you have to find the cue, you have to identify it, and then you have to also identify the reward. But the 4th thing, of course, is if you want to change habit, or the way to change habit is to make it satisfying. So there's 4 points, which is obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. Satisfying means, you know, the reward must be something that you desire, that you want at the end, and that will encourage you to sort of take that cycle yet again. And it's all about small, tiny differences. So again, it's back to the compass rule of, you know, if you're 1 degree off and you leave from Liverpool on your way to New York, you're going to end up, well, you're not going to end up in Mexico City, but you're going to end up somewhere. I don't know where. Where would you end up? It would be 1 degree difference. I bet it's a long way, but it doesn't matter. Pilots have got the same problem, of course. So there's an interesting thing about willpower, and I've got another slide for you, which is what's called the Kubler-Ross slide. Right, so this is basically how most normal people go through the process of change. And usually it's sort of, you start with this shock and surprise, and your morale sort of goes up, and you disbelieve, and then you believe that perhaps it might be possible. But inevitably, what happens is that you get this frustration level and then down where it doesn't seem to be working. And this must be extremely close to what happens with sports, men, women. I would think, but Christina, you know much better than I do, is that, you know, they must think, oh, you know, this is never going to get better. You get into depression, then you experiment. And this was true also of the example given in, I think it's in The Power of Habit, where he worked with, no, it's not, it's in Peak Performance. He worked with a student and made him try to remember numbers again and again and again and again. So that most people can only remember 7 numbers, and that's why we chunk them sort of 3s and 4s, because they're easier to remember. And with practice, this guy got up to 12. You know, he could remember 12 random numbers just given to him just by the researchers. He got very, very frustrated, went into depression, and then suddenly found a new way to hook his numbers in chunks, in groups. He had a system of branches, and a bit like the memory palace, and gradually got himself up to, eventually, to, I think it's 120 random numbers that he was 80, the second guy who did it was 120. 80 random numbers that he could recall and repeat immediately afterwards, or within 5 minutes of having been told all these random numbers. And this is this curve that you see, is that generally you tend to sort of go through this disbelief, looking for evidence that it isn't true. You don't want to do it. You get into frustration, depression, doesn't have to be serious depression, where you think, and a lot of people give up at that point, of course. And then that's why often you need a coach, or you need somebody who's outside of you who will give you the motivation to say, look, if you just change this little thing, that's when you start experimenting. That's when you start finding, then your decision goes up, and then you begin to integrate it into a new system of behavior. So that's that. The other sort of really nice case study is, of course, Schultz with Starbucks, where it's called the latte method. And what he realized is that you can make habits, you make something habitual before an event has happened. Now, he did this because he realized that, well, actually, there was a guy that he took off the street to work in his cafes. And the guy couldn't handle people who came and were irritable or were sort of unpleasant. And he realized that what he had to do was teach people a method that would become automatic, habitual, in order to deal with these things. And by repetition, which apparently they do with all their training, they train people how to deal with a fractious or a difficult customer. And it transformed this young guy's life. I think he's one of the general managers now, by having this automatic, habitual way of, and I know that we sometimes find that a bit irritating, that somebody is just not reacting to us when we're getting annoyed. But it's a very, very interesting case study, because he had to set a plan for when things go wrong. Now, that's sort of preempting something that hasn't even happened. But what it does tell us is that you can, and you often do, change your mindset so that you have the ability to deal with things in a different way. And, you know, the obvious thing is that when things go wrong, it's not, it doesn't necessarily come to you. It's a question of how you deal with it and how you approach it. So that was the Starbucks method. And then the techniques that come through from these books are what they call implementation intentions. So you need to have the will to do, and it is will at that point, or the desire to do it, to change a habit. And what I think it's James Clear calls it temptation bundling. So you need to bundle together all of those temptations and piggyback off the back of them. you need to reduce friction. There's a lot of things that cause a lot of resistance in habit change because they're habits, because they're much more comfortable being as they are and allowing you to think the way that you think. But if you want to change that, you must reduce the friction. And that he suggests doing in incredibly simple ways by, for instance, making something very easy to see or easy to find, or making sure that you have just that you set a pattern of little rituals, like drink a glass of water, write 5 pages, or whatever it is,
And that, I was just going to say, with that reducing friction, that can go the other way as well. As if, I know a lot of my friends, if they want to reduce social media, they'll take it off their phone so that it's harder to get to as well. So it can also go in both ways.
Absolutely. And so the other thing is, of course, that we mentioned before is make habits satisfying. That they have to be satisfying. If they're not satisfying, you're more than likely going to give them up, or you have to apply so much willpower that it will be exhausting and you'll give up as a result. The other thing is creating a framework, which is basically make sure that you get your environment, you get everything set up so that it makes it easier and more possible. And then there's this concept of habit stacking. So if you do successfully identify a habit and you manage to amend or change that behavior, stack something else on top of it. Say, right, so when I drink my glass of water, yes, I did write 2 pages, but I also want to write, I also want to, I don't know, to do a drawing or something. And that will be the next step within that whole sort of habit stacking thing. And the last thing was this thing about what's called the Goldilocks rule. But I think the Goldilocks rule is anything, anywhere that fits into a nice, comfortable zone. So I have got a last little slide, if I can get it. Yeah, and it's this one. So if the basic principle here is that if you want to change anything, and this comes partially from Socrates anyway, is that you have to have a positive outlook on the challenges. And there must be, it says here, driving motivation to achieve or become. I think that's more about sort of identifying the reward and the desire. And then you have to have, according to this anyway, you have to have a problem-solving approach to it. That you have to approach it as a task. It has to be something that you actually want to achieve, and that you apply tools or reason in order to gradually change that the habit. And then finally, repetition and maintenance, because we do slip back. Some of the thinking patterns or the habits that we have are deeply ingrained, and they are our behaviors. They're who we are. So getting rid of that is very difficult, and we do relapse. I mean, alcoholics are probably the best example of this, is that once you are an alcoholic, you are always an alcoholic, and you do need to maintain your abstinence as well. So that's pretty much all we've got, I think. I think that's pretty much all we've got, unless anybody has any questions, of course. Have you got any questions at all, Christina?
I think we covered a lot of stuff today. Yeah, I feel like we covered everything that we talked about. I don't know if anybody has any questions about any of the books. So we referenced James Clear, Atomic Habits, Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit, and then Tiny Habits by Fitzgerald. And we'll put all of those in the replay as well if you guys need any information about that.
Yeah.
But I feel like that was a very, very complete discussion about habits.
Yeah, the one that really has taken off lately is, of course, this book, and I will show you actually. Does that come out backwards for you? It's Atomic Habits by James Clear. He was just a bloggist who sort of got fixated on habits, weightlifting, and various other things, but it gradually grew, and he was the go-to place with anything to do with habits. And what is, as with his name, he is very clear. He's
Yeah.
very straightforward, which I absolutely love. I always admire people who can take complex subjects and make them simple and clear. And you know, there are some amazing scientists who can do this as well. The other book that we really sort of spoke about quite a bit, which is really the guru of habit, and he did, I mean, it's sort of 20 or 30 years of study, is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And that is really based in case studies, in proof, in scientific research, or reasonably scientific research. But that's carried out over sort of, I think it's 25 years of work that has come to this book. And it is really the authority on how habits actually work. And he goes into the neuroscience of it as well, and what areas of the brain are sort of working in which ways and how, which I don't think would be a good thing to go into right now.
For
It's a
another
bit
time. But so next week we'll be talking about the magic bullet, one of our favorite topics, exercise. So we'll be talking about that.
Well, this started with a friend of mine who, I can't remember where, we were walking somewhere, and he said, do you know, if there was one thing that would be a magic bullet, it would be exercise. And it sort of stuck with me for a while. And then I did a bit of research on it as well. And we will reveal all. And fortunately, we've got Christina with us here, who knows a lot.
Very excited about this. Yeah, and in the future, so we do have, if hopefully both of all of you guys are on either you know, Charles's newsletter or my newsletter. Charles and I are also posting these videos, the recordings, on our YouTube channels, Swellfed Living and Charles Thinking Mind. So please let us know any other topics that you'd like us to cover. We're going to be covering the magic bullet exercise. We'll be doing a couple of workshops that we're really excited to bring as well, and we'll be announcing those soon. So please stay in touch, and hope, you have a good week. And we'll talk to you next week, same time.
See you, everyone.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you. Bye.